In the Pacific jungle heat, under a sky that screamed with aircraft engines and artillery echoes, one Marine stared at a weapon he had never meant to touch on the ground, a downed aircraft's 20-millimeter cannon, half buried in mud, smoking from its crash. The Japanese were minutes away. Ammunition was running out, and no one else was coming. He knew two things for certain. If he didn't figure out a miracle, everyone on that ridgeline would die. This weapon was never meant to be fired by hand. Recoil would break bones, heat would melt metal, and misfires could explode in his face. But against every regulation, every instinct for self-preservation, every rule of physics and reason, he began modifying it for the brothers beside him, for the ones he refused to lose. What happened next? How one forgotten Marine created a battlefield monster that spat out death at impossible rates would never make it into the official history books, but it would save dozens of lives. This is his story. His name doesn't matter because history never bothered to remember it. Let's call him Corporal John Mitchell, though that's not his real name. No one alive today knows his real name. No citation, no medal, no photograph in a museum display case. Just a quiet man who knew how to fix things when they broke. Mitchell grew up in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of place where you learned to repair tractors because calling a mechanic meant waiting 3 weeks and spending money your family didn't have. His father taught him that everything mechanical had a logic to it. Find the logic, and you could make anything work, even if it wasn't supposed to. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Mitchell was 19 years old, working at a tool shop, saving money for a car he'd never own. He enlisted the next day, not because he was particularly patriotic, not because he hated the Japanese, but because everyone else was going, and it seemed like the right thing to do. Boot camp revealed what Mitchell already knew about himself. He wasn't the fastest runner. He wasn't the best shot. He wasn't the guy who gave inspiring speeches or led charges. But when a rifle jammed during training, he'd figure out why. When the truck wouldn't start before a drill, he'd be under the hood, hands black with grease, making it run. The drill instructors noticed. They always noticed the quiet ones who solve problems without being asked. They assigned him to an infantry unit as a rifleman, but everyone knew what he really was. The fixer, the guy you went to when standard solutions failed. His unit shipped out to the Pacific in early 1944. 18 men, most of them barely out of their teenage years, crammed into the bowels of a transport ship that rocked and heaved for 3 weeks straight. They vomited, they slept on metal floors, they played cards with water-damaged decks, and they told each other lies about how easy it would be. Mitchell didn't talk much during the voyage. He listened. He learned everyone's names, their hometowns, their fears. There was Private Danny Hale from Iowa, a farm kid with a sister he wrote to every other day. There was Corporal Rodriguez from Texas, who could make anyone laugh even when the latrine overflowed. There was Sergeant Williams, a career Marine who'd seen action in Nicaragua and treated the younger men like sons he never had. They became brothers long before they saw combat. That's how it works in the Corps. You don't choose your family, but you die for them anyway. The island they landed on, we'll call it by a name that doesn't matter, because a dozen Pacific islands looked exactly the same. Dense jungle that swallowed sound, heat that turned your uniform into a second skin of sweat, insects that bit through fabric, rain that came in sheets and turned foxholes into graves. Their mission was simple in theory: hold a ridge that overlooked a strategic valley, deny the Japanese access to a supply route, wait for reinforcements to push through and relieve them. Simple, until nothing goes according to plan. The first few days were almost peaceful. They dug foxholes, reinforced positions, strung wire, set up fields of fire. Sergeant Williams drilled them constantly. Check your weapon. conserve ammunition, stay alert, trust the man next to you. Mitchell spent his time doing what he always did, fixing things. A machine gun that wouldn't cycle properly, a radio that crackled too much static, a bayonet someone had dulled by using it to open ration cans. He worked quietly, efficiently, his hands always busy. Danny Hale watched him one afternoon, fascinated by how Mitchell could disassemble a rifle action blindfolded, find a grain of sand jamming the firing pin, and reassemble it in under a minute. "Where'd you learn that?" Hale asked. Mitchell shrugged. "My dad's tractor. Broke down every spring. You either learned to fix it, or you didn't eat." Hale grinned. "Remind me to stay close to you if things get bad." Mitchell smiled back. "Things are always bad. Question is, how bad?" 3 days later, they found out. The first attack came at 0300 hours. No warning, no preliminary artillery, just the sudden eruption of mortar rounds exploding across their position, turning night into flickering orange daylight. Mitchell was asleep in his foxhole when the first blast threw dirt across his face. He jerked awake, grabbed his rifle, and pressed himself against the mud wall as shells screamed overhead. Around him, men were shouting, scrambling, trying to orient themselves in the chaos. Sergeant Williams' voice cut through the noise. "Stand to! Stand to! They're coming!" And they were. Through the smoke and fire, shapes moved in the jungle below. Dozens of them, disciplined, coordinated, using the terrain like they'd been born in it. The Marines opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the ridge like a constellation of dying stars. Bullets snapped through foliage. Grenades tumbled down slopes and echoed with dull thumps. Men shrieked, men shouted, men just shrieked. Mitchell fired his rifle until the barrel burned his hands. He couldn't see what he was shooting at, just shapes and movement, and the absolute certainty that if he stopped firing, something would reach his position and kill him. The Japanese assault was relentless. They came in waves, each one probing for weakness, testing the Marines' fire discipline, forcing them to expend ammunition. And when one wave fell back, another surged forward, fresher, angrier. The machine gun nest to Mitchell's left suddenly went silent. He glanced over and saw why. The barrel had overheated, warped from sustained fire. The gunner, a kid from Michigan whose name Mitchell couldn't remember, looked at him with desperate eyes. "Mitchell," Sergeant Williams shouted, "can you fix that gun?" Mitchell didn't answer. He just ran, keeping low, sliding into the machine gun nest as bullets cracked past his head. The gunner, a kid from Michigan whose name Mitchell couldn't remember, looked at him with desperate eyes.
"It's fucked, man. It's completely fucked." Mitchell grabbed the weapon, felt the heat radiating from the barrel, saw the warped metal. No, this wasn't fixable. Not here, not now. "Give me your rifle," Mitchell said. "What?" "Your rifle, now." The gunner handed it over and Mitchell propped it against the sandbags, sighting down the barrel toward the jungle. "Fire from here. Slow, controlled. Make every shot count." Then he ran back to his own position, grabbed 2 ammunition bandoliers and distributed them to men running low. It wasn't much. It wouldn't be enough. But it was something. The attack lasted 40 minutes. When it finally broke, when the Japanese melted back into the jungle, the ridge was still in Marine hands. Barely. 4 men were dead, 7 wounded, 1 machine gun destroyed, ammunition reserves cut by 1/3, and everyone knew the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. The next attack would be worse. Dawn came slowly, filtering through smoke and mist. The Marines assessed damage, redistributed ammunition, buried the dead in shallow graves marked with helmets on rifles. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. Mitchell moved from position to position, checking weapons, making small repairs where possible. A broken sling, a bent sight, tiny things that might mean the difference between life and death when seconds mattered. Danny Hale sat with his back against a tree, hands shaking as he tried to write a letter home. He'd gotten halfway through the first sentence before his pencil snapped. Mitchell sat down beside him. "Your sister, right?" Hale nodded. "Emma. She's 16. Thinks I'm some kind of hero." He laughed bitterly. "If she could see me now, shaking like a damn coward." "You're not a coward," Mitchell said quietly. "You stood your ground. That's all anyone can do." "I'm terrified, Mitch. I mean, completely. Gut-wrenchingly terrified." "Good. Means you're smart." Mitchell pulled out his own ration cigarette, lit it, took a drag, and passed it to Hale. Hale took the cigarette with trembling hands. "You're afraid?" "Every second." They sat in silence, passing the cigarette back and forth until it burned down to nothing. Sergeant Williams called them together mid-morning. His face was grim. "Command says reinforcements are delayed. Supply drop missed the zone. Landed in Japanese-controlled territory. We're on our own for at least 3 more days." Someone cursed. Someone else laughed, the kind of laugh that had no humor in it. Williams continued. "We hold this ridge. That's the mission. We don't have enough ammunition for another sustained fight, so we conserve, we improvise, and we make every shot count. Understood?" "Understood, Sergeant." But I could see it in their eyes. They understood what Williams wasn't saying. 3 more days was a death sentence. The second attack came that night. Heavier, more coordinated. The Japanese had learned from the first assault, adjusted their tactics, concentrated their force against the weakened left flank. This time, the Marines' defensive fire was thinner, more sporadic. Ammunition discipline meant gaps in the curtain of bullets, gaps the enemy exploited ruthlessly. Mitchell fired until his rifle's bolt locked back on an empty chamber. He reloaded, chambered around, fired again. Beside him, Rodriguez took a bullet through the shoulder and fell back, clutching the wound, gasping in pain. "Corpsman!" someone screamed. "Corpsman!" But the corpsman was already busy with 3 other wounded men. The Japanese reached the wire. Some became entangled, shot down at point-blank range. Others cut through, pushed forward, made it to the first foxholes. Close combat, bayonets, rifle butts, knives, the kind of fighting that turned men into animals. Mitchell killed 2 men that night. He doesn't remember their faces. He remembers the resistance of flesh, the weight of bodies falling, the hot spray of blood on his hands. He remembers feeling nothing in the moment and everything afterwards. When the attack finally broke, when the Japanese withdrew into darkness, the ridge was still held, but barely. 6 more dead, 9 wounded, the machine gun position on the right flank destroyed, ammunition at critical levels, water supplies contaminated by a mortar hit on their supply cache, the radio damaged, reception intermittent at best. They were dying. Not quickly, slowly, like a wounded animal bleeding out in the jungle. Sergeant Williams gathered the remaining able-bodied men, 11 of them, out of the original 18. "Listen up," Williams said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "They'll come again, probably tomorrow night, maybe sooner. We don't have the ammunition to stop them." Silence, the kind that pressed down like physical weight. "So, we buy time. We set traps, we conserve every round, and when they come, we make them pay for every inch." Williams looked at each man individually. "You've all done your corps proud. No matter what happens, you've done your duty." It was a farewell speech. Everyone recognized it. The next morning brought something unexpected. The sound of aircraft engines. Everyone looked up, hope surging. Reinforcements? Supply drop? Air support? But the aircraft was American, a fighter, and it was trailing smoke. The engine sputtered, coughed, died. The plane nose down, spiraling, the pilot fighting for control. It crashed 300 yards from the ridge, tearing through jungle canopy, slamming into earth with a sound like the world breaking. Smoke rose in a thick, black column. "Should we check for survivors?" someone asked. "No," Williams flatly said. "That fire will draw every Jap in 5 miles. We stay put." But Mitchell couldn't stop staring at the crash site. Something about it pulled at his attention, an itch in his brain, the same feeling he got when looking at a broken machine that could be fixed if you just found the right approach. He thought about the aircraft's weapons. Fighters carried guns, big guns, cannons designed to destroy other aircraft. An idea began to form. Impossible, insane, but maybe, just maybe, possible. He pushed it down, tried to ignore it, focused on the immediate tasks. Cleaning weapons, redistributing ammunition, helping the wounded. But the idea wouldn't leave him alone.
That afternoon, Danny Hale took a mortar fragment to the leg. It happened during a random harassment barrage, the kind of fire designed to wear down morale rather than destroy positions. One shell landed close, too close. Shrapnel ripped through Hale's thigh, severing muscle, fracturing bone. He screamed, the kind of scream that turned Mitchell's blood cold. The corpsman worked fast, applying tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine. But even as he worked, Mitchell could see the assessment in his eyes. Bad. Very bad. Hale needed a hospital, surgery, proper medical care, things that didn't exist on this ridge. "Am I going to die?" Hale whispered, his face pale, lips trembling. "No," the corpsman lied smoothly. "You're gonna be fine. Just need to keep pressure on it, keep you stable until evac comes." But evac wasn't coming. Everyone knew it. Mitchell knelt beside Hale, took his hand. Hale gripped it hard, desperate. "I don't want to die here, Mitch. I promised Emma I'd come home. I promised." "You're not dying," Mitchell said, and he meant it. He would not allow it. Somehow, some way, Hale would survive this. He just had to figure out how. That night, while Hale slept fitfully under morphine, Mitchell sat in his foxhole and thought about the crashed aircraft, about its cannon, about desperation and impossibility, and the promise he'd made to a dying friend. The Japanese would attack again, tomorrow or the day after. One more assault would break them. There wasn't enough ammunition, enough men, enough anything to hold. Unless he could create a weapon that turned the equation upside down. Something with enough firepower to stop a mass assault cold. Something terrifying. The aircraft cannon. 20 millimeter. Designed to shoot down bombers. Cyclic rate of 650 rounds per minute. Each shell explosive, designed to punch through metal and detonate inside. If he could make it work. If he could mount it. If he could feed it. If he could fire it without it exploding in his face. Too many ifs. But Hale was dying. They were all dying. Mitchell made his decision. He told no one. At 0400, while the others slept, he slipped out of the perimeter and made his way to the crash site. The jungle at night was a special kind of hell. Every sound could be an enemy. Every shadow could hide death. Mitchell moved slowly, carefully, rifle ready, heart hammering. The crashed fighter was a burned. That afternoon, Danny Hale took a mortar fragment to the leg. It happened during a random harassment barrage, the kind of fire designed to wear down morale rather than destroy positions. One shell landed close, too close. Shrapnel ripped through Hale's thigh, severing muscle, fracturing bone. He screamed, the kind of scream that turned Mitchell's blood cold. The corpsman worked fast, applying tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine. But even as he worked, Mitchell could see the assessment in his eyes. Bad. Very bad. Hale needed a hospital, surgery, proper medical care. Things that didn't exist on this ridge. "Am I gonna die?" Hale whispered, his face pale, lips trembling. "No," the corpsman lied smoothly. "You're gonna be fine. Just need to keep pressure on it, keep you stable until evac comes." But evac wasn't coming. Everyone knew it. Mitchell knelt beside Hale, took his hand. Hale gripped it hard, desperate. "I don't want to die here, Mitch. I promised Emma I'd come home. I promised." "You're not dying," Mitchell said, and he meant it. He would not allow it. Somehow, some way, Hale would survive this. He just had to figure out how. That night, while Hale slept fitfully under morphine, Mitchell sat in his foxhole and thought about the crashed aircraft, about its cannon, about desperation and impossibility, and the promise he'd made to a dying friend. The Japanese would attack again, tomorrow or the day after. One more assault would break them. There wasn't enough ammunition, enough men, enough anything to hold. Unless he could create a weapon that turned the equation upside down. Something with enough firepower to stop a mass assault cold. Something terrifying. The aircraft cannon. 20mm, designed to shoot down bombers. Cyclic rate of 650 rounds per minute. Each shell explosive, designed to punch through metal and detonate inside. If he could make it work, if he could mount it, if he could feed it, if he could fire it without it exploding in his face. Too many ifs. But Hale was dying. They were all dying. Mitchell made his decision. He told no one. At 0400, while the others slept, he slipped out of the perimeter and made his way to the crash site. The jungle at night was a special kind of hell. Every sound could be an enemy. Every shadow could hide death. Mitchell moved slowly, carefully, rifle ready, heart hammering. The crashed fighter was a burnt-out skeleton. The fire had died to embers, but heat still radiated from twisted metal. The pilot's body was still in the cockpit, charred beyond recognition. Mitchell whispered a prayer and moved on. The nose section had broken off during the crash, rolled 20 feet away, and there, still mounted but bent, scorched, half buried in mud, was the 20mm cannon. Mitchell stared at it. Up close, it looked even more impossible. The mounting brackets were sheared, the ammunition feed was crushed, the barrel was canted at an angle, the firing mechanism was probably damaged. This was insane. He began to work. First, he had to free it from the wreckage. The mounting bolts were fused by heat and impact. He used his bayonet as a pry bar, his rifle butt as a hammer. Every ounce of strength he possessed. Metal screamed. His hands bled. 30 minutes of brutal effort before the cannon finally broke free. It was heavier than he expected. 70, 80 pounds, maybe more. He dragged it through the mud, stopping every few feet to listen, to scan the darkness for movement. It took him an hour to drag the cannon back to the ridge. By the time he reached the perimeter, dawn was breaking and every muscle in his body screamed. Sergeant Williams was waiting for him. "Mitchell, what the hell are you doing?" Mitchell couldn't explain, not yet, until he knew if it was even possible. "Just give me today, Sergeant. If I can't make this work by tonight, I'll drop it." Williams looked at the cannon, at Mitchell's bleeding hands, at the desperate determination in his eyes. "You've got until 1800 hours. Then I need you on the line." Mitchell worked like a man possessed. First problem, the mount.
The cannon needed to be stabilized, angled correctly, and able to absorb recoil that would otherwise flip it backward or tear it apart. He found a tree trunk blown down during the previous night's barrage. Thick, solid. He dragged it to a position on the left flank where the fields of fire converged. Using his bayonet, his knife, and a piece of shrapnel sharpened to an edge, he carved out a channel in the wood. The cannon fit. Barely. He packed the gaps with sandbags, rope scavenged from parachute cord, strips of cloth torn from his own uniform. It looked like something a madman would create, which was accurate. Second problem, the ammunition feed. The aircraft's belt feed system was crushed, unusable, but the cannon itself could chamber rounds manually if he could force them in at the right angle. He took apart the feed mechanism, studying how it worked. Spring-loaded carrier, cam-driven bolt. Simple in concept, complex in execution. He needed gravity and angle to do what springs and motors had done in the aircraft. He mounted the feed assembly sideways, propped at an angle using metal brackets salvaged from the wreck. The ammunition belt would hang down, feeding shells into the chamber by weight alone. It was crude. It would jam, but it might work. Third problem, ignition. The aircraft's electrical firing system was gone. He needed a mechanical solution. He studied the cannon's receiver, found the firing pin, traced the mechanism. He needed something to strike the pin with enough force to set off the primer. A lever, a hammer. He made a firing handle from a piece of scrap metal, heating it in a small fire until it was soft enough to bend, shaping it with rocks, quenching it in water. He attached it to the firing pin mechanism using wire wrapped so tight that it cut his fingers. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It might kill him when he tried to fire it. But it might work. Other Marines watched him work. Some curious, some concerned, some certain he'd lost his mind. Rodriguez, his shoulder bandaged, sat nearby. "Mitch, you really think that thing will fire?" "Don't know," Mitchell said honestly. "But if it does, it'll change everything. And if it doesn't, then I wasted a day, and we die tomorrow instead of today." Rodriguez laughed. It hurt his shoulder, but he laughed anyway. Can't argue with that logic. By 1700 hours, Mitchell had done everything he could.
He pulled the lever. The cannon roared. The sound was apocalyptic, louder than any rifle, any machine gun, any mortar. A rapid hammering that vibrated through bone, that turned the air into pressure waves. The first shell exploded against a tree, blowing it apart. The second hit dirt, erupting in a shower of mud. The third, fourth, fifth, each one detonating with shocking violence. The recoil slammed into the wooden mount. The entire assembly shuddered, shifted, but held. Smoke poured from the barrel. Shell casings flew in arcs, clattering against rocks. Mitchell kept firing until the belt went empty. 20 rounds in 6 seconds. 20 explosions that transformed jungle into a kill zone. When the gun went silent, his ears rang so badly he couldn't hear his own breathing. His hands were numb from vibration. The barrel glowed dull red, but it had worked. Behind him, men were shouting, cheering, slapping each other's backs. Rodriguez was laughing, almost crying. Even Sergeant Williams allowed himself a thin smile. "How much ammunition can you get?" Williams asked. Mitchell had already counted. "Maybe 300 rounds, that's it." "Then make 'em count, because when they come again, that's our last chance." The Japanese attacked at 2200 hours. They came in force, more than before, a final push to annihilate the Marine position before reinforcements could arrive. Mortars fell like rain. Machine gun fire raked the ridge from multiple angles. And through the smoke and fire, men surged forward, hundreds of them, disciplined, determined, prepared to overrun the Americans through sheer numbers. The Marines opened fire with everything they had left. Rifles cracked. The remaining machine gun chattered. Grenades tumbled down slopes, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. They kept coming. 50 yards out. 40. 30. Mitchell sat behind his improvised cannon, watching the assault develop. His hands were wrapped in cloth to protect against the heat he knew was coming. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to survive. But Hale was behind him. Rodriguez was behind him. Williams was behind him. Men who'd trusted him. Men who'd become his brothers. He thought about his father's tractor, about finding logic in broken things, about refusing to quit when everything seemed impossible. Come on then. Let's see what you've got. 25 yards. He gripped the firing lever. 20 yards. He sighted down the barrel at the center of mass. 15 yards. He pulled. The monster awakened. The cannon erupted in sustained fury. Each shell exploded on impact, ripping through flesh, shattering bone, turning men into red mist. The cyclic rate was insane, unholy, a drumbeat from hell itself. The first belt emptied in seconds. Mitchell yanked it clear, loaded another, kept firing. The wooden mount creaked, cracked, but held. The barrel began to glow brighter, cherry red, the heat visible even in darkness. The Japanese assault faltered. Men fell by the dozen. Others tried to push through, but the explosive shells created a barrier of death that couldn't be crossed. Mitchell's hands burned, the cloth wrapping smoked, his vision blurred from heat shimmer, but he kept firing, kept feeding belts, kept turning the weapon into an engine of survival. To his left and right, Marines watched in shock. Some had stopped shooting entirely, just staring at the carnage Mitchell was unleashing. The enemy broke, not retreated, broke. Men turned and ran, abandoning weapons, abandoning wounded, fleeing into jungle darkness. Mitchell fired until the barrel seized, until the final belt was empty, until his hands were too damaged to grip the lever anymore. Then he collapsed backward, gasping, hands held up before his face. The skin was burned, blistered, some places down to raw meat. He couldn't feel his fingers, couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched whine. The corpsman ran to him, began treating his hands, wrapping them in whatever clean cloth remained. But Mitchell wasn't listening. He was looking at Hale, at Rodriguez, at Williams, at all the men still alive because of what he'd done. The ridge had held. Danny Hale lived for 4 more days. The infection in his leg progressed despite antibiotics, despite care, despite everything the corpsman tried, but he was lucid, able to write letters home, able to say goodbye. Mitchell sat with him every day, his own hands wrapped in bandages, useless but healing. On the 4th day, his fever spiked. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In a rare moment of clarity, he gripped Mitchell's arm. "You got me those extra days. 4 days I shouldn't have had. 4 letters I got to write. Thank you." "You're going to make it," Mitchell said, but his voice cracked. "No," Hale smiled weakly, "but that's okay. Tell Emma I kept my promise. Tell her I fought well." He died that evening, quietly, Sergeant Williams holding one hand, Mitchell holding the other. They buried him on the ridge, marked his grave with his helmet and dog tags. Mitchell stood at attention until long after everyone else had left, staring at the fresh dirt, wondering why he'd survived and Hale hadn't. Reinforcements arrived the next day, fresh troops, supplies, artillery support. The ridge was relieved, the survivors rotated to rear areas for rest and recovery. An officer came to inspect the defensive positions. He saw the improvised cannon, now cold, silent, covered in carbon scoring and cracked from thermal stress. "Who authorized this weapon?" he asked Sergeant Williams. "No one, sir. Corporal Mitchell rigged it on his own initiative." The officer examined the mount, the feed system, the firing mechanism. "Dangerous, reckless, against regulations." He paused. "But effective. Make note of it in the after-action report under improved defenses. No need for specific details." And that was it. The cannon was dismantled,
the parts buried. The innovation that had saved dozens of lives was filed away as a footnote, too irregular to celebrate, too effective to completely ignore. Mitchell received no commendation, no medal, no official recognition. But when his unit reorganized, when the roster was read, when the survivors stood together, they knew. Rodriguez clasped his shoulder. "You saved us all, brother." Williams shook his hand carefully, mindful of the healing burns. "Best Marine I ever served with." And Mitchell, for just a moment, allowed himself to believe it might be true.
The war ended eventually. Mitchell survived. He came home to Pennsylvania, to a town that held a parade for its veterans, to people who thanked him for his service without understanding what that service had cost. His hands healed, mostly. The burns left scars that never fully faded, thick tissue that limited flexibility, constant reminders of the day he'd pulled a firing lever until his flesh cooked. He went back to work at the tool shop, married a local girl who asked few questions, had 2 children who grew up never quite understanding why their father sometimes woke screaming, why he couldn't stand loud noises, why his hands shook when he tried to hold delicate things. He never talked about the war. When people asked, he gave simple answers. Yes, he'd been in the Pacific. Yes, he'd seen combat. No, nothing particularly special happened. At night, alone, he thought about Hale, about Rodriguez, about Sergeant Williams and the 11 men who'd held that ridge against impossible odds. Some of them survived the war, some didn't. Mitchell attended reunions when he could, shook hands with men who understood without words needing to be spoken. They called him the man who saved the ridge when officers weren't listening. They bought him drinks. They told their children about him in vague terms that never quite captured what had happened. But there was no official record, no documentation, no citation in military archives, just scattered memories held by men growing older, their numbers thinning each year. Mitchell died in 1987, in his sleep, in the house he'd lived in for 40 years. His obituary was 2 paragraphs long, survived by his wife, his children, his grandchildren, worked at the same tool shop for 4 decades, active in his church, a quiet man, neighbors said, kind, helpful. No mention of war, no mention of a ridge in the Pacific, no mention of the day he'd turned a crashed aircraft's cannon into a weapon that defied logic and saved lives. His family found a box in his attic after the funeral. Inside, photographs of young men in Marine uniforms, letters yellowed with age, a medal he'd never worn, given to him by his unit at a reunion, unofficial, paid for by the men themselves. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, the scarred, burned firing lever he'd made from scrap metal on a ridge that history forgot. His daughter held it, turned it over in her hands, trying to understand what it meant. She never figured it out. How could she? You had to be there. You had to smell the smoke and hear the screams and feel the weight of impossible choices. You had to know what it meant to look at broken things and refuse to accept that they couldn't be fixed. You had to be John Mitchell, the Marine who built a monster and saved his brothers. In the vast catalog of World War II history, in the countless volumes written about battles and heroes and turning points, there is no mention of this story. The ridge has no name you'd recognize. The unit's records are filed away, accessible only to researchers willing to dig through decades of paperwork. But somewhere in a military cemetery, there's a headstone for Daniel Hale, 1925 to 1944, who died of wounds but lived 4 days longer than he should have. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, in a house that's been sold and resold and renovated beyond recognition, there once lived a man who knew how to fix broken things. He fixed tractors and rifles and radios and lives.
He fixed the impossible equation of a doomed defensive position with nothing but determination and a willingness to try what shouldn't work. He never asked for recognition, never sought glory, never told his story except in fragments late at night to men who'd been there and already knew. But for 18 men on a forgotten ridge, for the ones who survived and the ones who didn't, for the brothers who held the line when every rational calculation said they'd fail, he was everything that mattered. He was the Marine who refused to quit, who looked at a weapon that couldn't work and made it work anyway, who pulled a firing lever until his hands burned because the alternative was watching his friends die. In the terror of war, sometimes the greatest acts of courage are never cataloged, never photographed, never written into the grand narratives of history. Sometimes one man, armed with nothing but desperation, loyalty, and a willingness to try what shouldn't work, picks up a broken weapon and refuses to let the people he loves die. And that is how one Marine, in one forgotten moment, used an impossible modification to change not the war, but the fate of every brother on that ridge. His name doesn't matter anymore. The specific island doesn't matter. The exact date doesn't matter. What matters is this: he was there. He fought. He saved lives. And then he went home and never spoke of it again. That's heroism in its purest form. Not seeking glory, not demanding recognition, just doing what needed to be done, paying the price it required, and carrying the weight silently for the rest of your life. Somewhere in the Pacific, jungle has reclaimed a ridge where men once fought and died. The foxholes have collapsed, the wire has rusted to nothing, the graves have been moved to proper cemeteries or lost entirely. But if you knew where to look, if you dug deep enough through the undergrowth and soil, you might find fragments, a shell casing, a piece of melted metal, the buried remains of a weapon that shouldn't have worked. And if you held those fragments in your hands and knew their story, you'd understand something fundamental about human nature. We are capable of incredible things when driven by love for others. We can transform the impossible into the inevitable. We can take broken pieces and build miracles. Not because we're special, not because we're superhuman, but because sometimes the only choice is between trying and failing, or not trying and watching everyone you love die. Mitchell chose to try, against odds, against reason, against every voice that said it couldn't be done. And for one night, on one ridge, that choice made all the difference. This was his war, his moment, his gift to the men who trusted him. And though history never recorded his name, though no museum displays his story, though his grandchildren never knew what their quiet grandfather had done, it mattered. It mattered to Hale, who got 4 more days. It mattered to Rodriguez, who went home to Texas. It mattered to Williams, who retired with honor. It mattered to every man who walked off that ridge alive. And in the end, isn't that what heroism really is? Not monuments or medals or glory. Just doing what needed to be done, paying the price it required, and carrying the weight silently for the rest of your life. That's what John Mitchell did. That's why his story, even untold, even forgotten, even buried under decades of silence, deserves to be remembered. Not as history, but as truth. The truth that one Marine, one weapon, one impossible decision changed everything for the men who needed it most.
Years after the war, at a reunion in 1972, the survivors gathered one last time. Only 7 of them left by then. Age and illness and the simple passage of time had claimed the others. They met at a hotel in San Diego, men in their late 40s and early 50s now, graying, thickening around the middle, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide the military bearing they'd never lost. Mitchell almost didn't go. His wife had to convince him, reminding him that these men were his brothers, that some opportunities don't come twice. When he walked into the hotel conference room, 7 men stood at once. Not at attention, exactly, but close enough. And for a moment, they weren't middle-aged veterans with mortgages and desk jobs. They were young Marines again, standing together on a ridge, bound by something deeper than blood. Rodriguez crossed the room first, wrapped Mitchell in a hug that lasted long enough to say everything words couldn't. Williams shook his hand with the same careful respect for the scars. The others followed, one by one, clasping shoulders, exchanging the kind of looks that held entire conversations. They spent 3 days together, talking, laughing, crying when they thought no one was looking. They told stories about the men who weren't there, keeping them alive through memory. On the final night, Williams presented Mitchell with a gift, a plaque made of polished wood with a small brass plate engraved with words, "To the Marine who saved us all, with eternal gratitude, Semper Fi." Mitchell stared at it, unable to speak. His hands trembled as he took it. "We pooled our money," Rodriguez explained, "had it made special. We wanted you to know that we remember, that what you did mattered, that you're the reason any of us made it home." Mitchell looked at these men, his brothers, and saw the same thing in all their eyes. Not just gratitude, not just respect, but understanding. They knew what that day had cost him. They knew about the nightmares he'd never mentioned. They knew about the price of survival. "I just did what anyone would have done," Mitchell said quietly. "No," Williams corrected gently. "You did what no one else could have done, and we're alive because of it." They stood together, 7 men bound by a moment in time that would never release them. 7 survivors of 18 who'd held a ridge. 7 witnesses to courage that would never be officially recorded. That night, alone in his hotel room, Mitchell held the plaque and wept. Not from sadness, not from regret, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being understood, of knowing that the choice he'd made on that ridge had mattered to the people who mattered most. He hung the plaque in his workshop, where his family would see it but never quite understand it, where he could look at it while fixing broken lawnmowers and appliances, and remember that once, long ago, he'd fixed something far more important. He'd fixed the impossible equation of doomed men facing certain death. He'd fixed it with ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice his own hands, his own safety, his own future for the brothers beside him. In the decades that followed, as the 20th century gave way to the 21st century, as World War II veterans grew older and their numbers dwindled, Mitchell's story remained untold. His children knew he'd served. They knew he'd been in combat, but the details stayed locked away. Too painful to share, too personal to explain. When Mitchell's wife died in 1985, his daughter found him in his workshop, holding the plaque, tears running down his weathered face. She sat with him, held his hand, and for the first time, he told her fragments of the story. Not everything, not the full horror, but enough. He told her about a ridge, about men he loved like brothers, about a weapon he'd built from desperation and scrap metal, about a friend named Danny Hale, who died with grace and courage. His daughter listened, and though she couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he'd done, she understood that her quiet father, the man who'd fixed her bicycle and taught her how to change a tire, had once been someone extraordinary. "Why didn't you ever talk about it?" she asked. Mitchell was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Because the ones who deserved recognition didn't come home. Because I survived when better men died. Because every time I think about that night, I wonder if I could have done more. saved more, been faster or smarter or braver. Dad, you saved lives. That's what matters. Maybe. He looked at the plaque, at the words engraved in brass. Maybe the cannon could have exploded and killed us all. Maybe I made a reckless choice and happened to be right. But you weren't reckless. You were brave. Mitchell shook his head. Bravery is facing fear and doing what's right anyway. What I did was desperation. I didn't have a choice. Or rather, the only choice was between trying something impossible and watching everyone die. His daughter squeezed his scarred hand. That's still a choice, Dad. And you made the right one. Mitchell smiled sadly. Tell that to Hale. Tell that to the 4 men who died in the attacks before I got that weapon working. Tell them I made the right choice. They would thank you for trying, for caring enough to try. And maybe that was true. Maybe the men who died before the cannon roared would have been grateful that their brothers survived. Maybe Hale, and whatever comes after, knew that his extra 4 days had been a gift purchased with Mitchell's hands and determination. Or maybe none of it mattered in the grand scheme of history, in the vast sweep of wars and nations, and the millions who fought and died. But it mattered in the small sphere of one unit on one ridge. It mattered to the men who walked away. It mattered to their children and grandchildren who existed because a Marine named Mitchell refused to quit. That's the paradox of war. The largest events in human history come down to the smallest moments. One man, one decision, one weapon that shouldn't work, and lives saved or lost based on choices made in seconds.
Mitchell died 2 years later, peacefully, surrounded by family. At his funeral, 3 men in their 60s attended, wearing Marine Corps League caps, standing at attention as the coffin was lowered. Rodriguez, Williams, and 1 other survivor. The last of the Ridge. The final witnesses. After the service, they approached Mitchell's children and told them stories their father had never shared. Stories about his courage, his ingenuity, his selflessness. Stories about the day he'd built a monster and saved their lives. "Your father was the finest Marine I ever served with," Williams said, his voice thick with emotion. "He gave us our futures. Every day we lived after that ridge was a gift from him." Rodriguez added, "We wanted you to know. Even if the Corps never recognized him, even if history never recorded it, we knew. We remembered. And we'll carry his story until we're gone too." Mitchell's daughter thanked them, her eyes wet with tears, finally understanding the depth of what her father had been, what he'd done, what he'd carried silently for 40 years. The 3 Marines stood together at Mitchell's grave after everyone else had left. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply stood, 3 old men at the grave of their brother, remembering a time when they'd been young and terrified, and certain they would die, remembering the Marine who'd saved them. Today, there are no surviving witnesses. Rodriguez died in 1995, Williams in 2001, the last survivor in 2008. The Ridge's defenders are gone, taking their memories with them. Mitchell's grandchildren know vague stories about their grandfather's war service, passed down through family legend, details blurred by time and retelling. They know he did something brave. They know other Marines respected him. But the specifics are lost. The plaque hangs in a grandson's garage now, polished wood and brass, the engraving still clear, "To the Marine who saved us all." The grandson sometimes looks at it and wonders, who was his grandfather really? What did he do to earn such devotion from his fellow Marines? He's researched military records, finding Mitchell's basic service history. Enlisted 1942, Pacific Theater. Honorable discharge 1945. But no details, no citations, no dramatic narrative. Just another veteran among millions.
another man who served and came home and lived a quiet life. The grandson will never know the full story. The records don't exist. The witnesses are gone. The ridge itself has no marker, no memorial, no indication that anything significant happened there. But in a way, that's appropriate. Because Mitchell never wanted recognition. He never sought glory. He just did what needed to be done and carried the weight of it silently. And perhaps that's the most profound kind of heroism, the kind that saves lives and then fades into obscurity, the kind that changes everything for a small group of people without changing anything for the wider world, the kind that future generations will never fully understand, but whose effects ripple forward through time in the lives saved, the children born, the families created because one man refused to accept the impossible. If you could go back to that ridge, to that moment when Mitchell gripped the firing lever with hands that would never fully heal, what would you say to him? Would you tell him about the lives he'd save? About Rodriguez's grandchildren? 3 generations of a family that exists because Mitchell pulled that lever. About William's daughter who became a doctor, treating thousands. Her entire existence dependent on her father surviving that night. Would you tell him about the reunion in 1972? About how 7 men would stand when he entered the room? About how they'd never forget what he did? Would you tell him that his story, even untold officially, would matter? That decades later, people would understand what his sacrifice meant? Or would you say nothing? Would you let him make his choice without the weight of future knowledge, without the burden of understanding how many lives hang in the balance? Maybe silence is best. Maybe heroes don't need to know they're heroes. Maybe the choice is purer when made without calculation, without weighing outcomes, without knowing the future you're creating. Mitchell pulled that lever because his friends were dying, because Hale had promised his sister he'd come home, because Rodriguez and Williams and all the others deserved a chance to survive. He didn't pull it for glory or recognition or history. He pulled it because, in that moment, it was the only thing he could do. And that purity of purpose, that absolute clarity of choice, is what makes his story transcendent. Not because he was superhuman, not because he had special training or extraordinary abilities, but because he was ordinary. A mechanic from Pennsylvania who knew how to fix things. And when faced with the most broken situation imaginable, when confronted with impossible odds and certain death, he applied the same logic his father had taught him about tractors. Find the problem, find the solution, make it work. The problem: overwhelming enemy force, insufficient firepower. The solution: a weapon that shouldn't work, modified beyond reason. Make it work. Pull the lever until your hands burn, until the barrel melts, until the enemy breaks, or you die trying. Simple, brutal, effective. That's the essence of Mitchell's heroism. Not complexity, not grand strategy, just simple determination applied to an impossible problem. And it worked.
In the final analysis, what is Mitchell's legacy? Not monuments, there are none. Not medals. The Corps never awarded him any for that action. Not fame. His name is forgotten outside his family. His legacy is measured in lives. In Rodriguez laughing at his grandson's birthday party in 1989. In Williams teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle in 1952. In every moment of joy, every celebration, every ordinary day experienced by men who should have died on a Pacific ridge but didn't. His legacy is measured in choices, in the courage to try when failure seems certain, in the refusal to accept that some problems can't be solved, in the willingness to pay any price to protect the people you love. His legacy is measured in silence, in the stories never told, the recognition never sought, the glory never claimed, in carrying the weight of impossible choices with dignity and grace.
And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. Because in the end, what matters most isn't how history remembers you. It's whether the people who needed you in the moment you were needed most survived because you refused to quit. Mitchell gave his brothers their futures. He gave them the chance to grow old, to love, to build families, to live ordinary lives far from Pacific ridges and midnight attacks. He gave them time. 4 extra days for Hale, 40 more years for Rodriguez, 56 for Williams. And all it cost him was his hands, his hearing, his sleep, and 40 years of silent burden. Any of them would tell you it was worth it. Mitchell saved their lives, and they lived those lives with gratitude, with purpose, with the understanding that they'd been given a gift. The gift of a Marine who looked at a broken weapon and refused to accept it couldn't work. The gift of a man who pulled a lever until his flesh cooked because the alternative was unthinkable. The gift of a brother who loved them enough to risk everything. And this is where the story ends. Not with triumph or tragedy, but with simple truth. There was a Marine. His name was probably not Mitchell, but we'll call him that because his real name is lost. He served in the Pacific. He held a ridge against impossible odds. He modified an aircraft canyon in a way that defied logic and saved lives. Then he came home, lived quietly, died peacefully, and was forgotten by everyone except the men whose lives he saved. That's not a Hollywood ending. There's no dramatic music, no freeze frame of heroic poses, no closing narration about how his actions changed the course of the war. Because they didn't change the war. The war ground on, indifferent to one Marine's desperate innovation on one forgotten ridge. But they changed everything for 18 men, for the families those men would create, for the ripples of consequence spreading forward through time. And if you trace those ripples, if you followed the threads of lives saved and futures created, you'd find that Mitchell's forgotten heroism touched thousands. The children Rodriguez raised, the patients Williams' daughter treated, the students one survivor taught, the businesses another built, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, lives upon lives upon lives, all existing because one Marine refused to quit. That's the true measure of heroism, not in the history books, not in official recognition, but in the lives saved and the futures created and the love that continues across generations. Mitchell would never know. He died believing he'd simply done his duty, nothing special, nothing worthy of remembrance. But he was wrong. What he did mattered. It mattered then. It matters now. It will matter as long as any descendant of those saved men draws breath and loves and creates their own legacy. That's immortality. Not in monuments, but in consequences. Not in stories, but in lives. And that is why this story, even forgotten, even unrecorded, even lost to official history, deserves to be told. Not because it's unique. Countless acts of courage like this happen in countless wars performed by countless forgotten heroes, but because it represents something fundamental about human nature. We can be extraordinary when we need to be. We can solve impossible problems when the stakes demand it. We can sacrifice ourselves for others without thought of reward. Not because we're soldiers, or Marines, or warriors, but because we're human. And sometimes, being human means looking at a broken weapon and seeing possibility, means pulling a lever until your hands burn, means carrying silent burdens for 40 years, means being a hero without ever knowing it. That was Mitchell. That was his story. That was his gift to the men who needed him most. And though history forgot his name, though no record preserves his actions, though his sacrifice went unrecognized by the nation he served, he succeeded in the only measure that truly mattered. His brothers survived. They went home. They lived. And for one Marine on one forgotten ridge, that was enough. Semper Fidelis, always faithful, to the end.